Good morning and welcome back to 7 Minutes of Sport. As always, I'm Christina, your host for this podcast, and we are thrilled to be returning for yet another season. We've lined up a range of guests who are going to be joining me throughout these short episodes to discuss a range of topics within the field of sports law. Now, before we kickstart this episode, a massive thank you to everyone who contacted us to give us feedback about season one. We really were blown away with just how many people listened and enjoyed the episodes, and we have taken all of that feedback on board. So please do continue to contact us, especially if you like what you're listening to. So, with that little spiel done, it's time to move on to this episode itself, which is focusing on the crackdown on rugby match official abuse. We've been looking forward to recording this episode as the guest who has given up their time to join us today is a former international rugby union referee who has presided over more Rugby World Cup matches than anyone else in history, including the 2023 Rugby World Cup final. Not only is he one of the world's leading international sports officials, but he's a partner at Squire, Patton, Boggs, where he's been able to bridge the world of law and sport. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Wayne Barnes. Wayne, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Christina. Thanks very much. Pleasure to join you.
We are very happy to have you on here. So now, actually, one of the many questions that we received was how we timed these interviews. And as high budget as I like to think this podcast is, I'm actually just using the timer on my phone. So I have the timer with me here. So unless you have any questions, I'm ready to go. So are you ready for me to press the button?
All ready.
Fantastic. So, as I have briefly explained, you are a retired international rugby union referee. What was your journey into refereeing at such a high level?
So, rather than Christina reminding me that I'm retired, it definitely ages you. You don't expect to be told that you're retired. So, I was 44 when I retired from rugby, but started refereeing. My first game of rugby was as a 15-year-old. Back in the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, where I played from about 5 or 6, injured playing. And then a friend of my dad's was a referee, and he said, look, you can't keep having weekends off. So why don't you give refereeing a go? So I gave it a go. My first game was Bream Thirds versus Berry Hill Whoppers, which was the 4th team of the local village team from Berry Hill. And I ran around that pitch that day, being told what to do by 30 grown men, not having a clue what I was doing. But I found out afterwards a lovely tradition about refereeing, in that you get a couple of pounds travelling expenses, and you get a tankard with referee written on it, and you can go into the bar afterwards and have a couple of free pints. Now, as a 15-year-old, I thought this was brilliant, and so that was the start of my journey, and then just like other players and officials and coaches, you just move through the ranks. If you do well at the 3rd teams, you get a chance at the 2nd teams. You do well at the 2nd teams, you you keep advancing. And over the next couple of years, when I was studying my A levels, I carried on to do that, and then I went off to university, started to play again. The knee had kind of recovered. And I would play on a Wednesday and then referee on a Saturday, and juggle the two. And juggling has always been part of my life, whether that's juggling between playing and refereeing, or juggling at the criminal bar and refereeing, or juggling now. Well, not now, but juggling over the last few years, being a partner at Squires and a referee of international rugby matches. So. Yeah, it's something that's followed me throughout my career.
Now, I may be going into slightly dangerous waters here because I'm using the word retire again. But I wondered, when you made the decision to retire from refereeing, was there any particular reason for that?
So my first international match was back in 2006, Fiji versus Samoa in Suva. The following year, I refereed my first Six Nations and then was selected to go to the World Cup. So 2007 was my first World Cup. This was my 5th World Cup. And so, a huge kind of period of time, a huge chunk of my life spent traveling around the world. I've got 2 youngish children now, they're 9 and 7, who, extremely kind of obsessed with their sports, whether that be football, cricket, a little bit of rugby, though they seem to have become a bit less obsessed with rugby and a lot more with football. But my wife works full time as well, and you spend a lot of time away from home, whether that be 9 weeks that I was over in Paris this year, or the June before that I was in New Zealand refereeing the Ireland versus New Zealand kind of test series for 3.5 weeks. You miss the weekends, and you miss seeing your children grow up, and you miss spending time with your loved ones. And there's a lot of expectation that referees' partners, kind of look after everything at home while you're away gallivanting around the world. And so eventually it was time to call it a day, and it felt like the exact right time to call it a day. After 111 test matches, finish at a World Cup final, it perhaps doesn't get much better than that.
No, it really doesn't. Now, we are focusing on this episode on the crackdown of match official abuse. It's been quite widely reported that the RFU have started to take steps to crack down on it. Can you describe what, if any, abuse you faced while being a referee?
So I think there's 2 things. I think there's a general abuse, societal abuse that we see growing more and more, particularly with online abuse. And we've seen the implementation of the Online Safety Act to try and start to deal with some of that. And that's not just aimed at match officials. We see that aimed at players, at coaches, at administrators across all sports. It's not just rugby which has to deal with that societal problem.
Yeah.
From a match official point of view, we see in the community game in particular, there was a survey of rugby officials in 2022 and 2023, which showed that almost 50% of all match officials said that in the previous season they were abused, which is a shocking statistic, but also worrying in so much as that if people aren't willing to give up their time, because remember, match officials in the community game aren't paid. If they're not willing to give up their time, you can't have a game of rugby. So someone either has to go and referee the game, or you kind of don't have a match. So that's worrying when people are saying I'm being abused, because who's going to want to go and do a job which they don't get paid for when they're being shouted and screamed and abused? So that was something that the RFU said, we need to stop this. We need to have a deterrent for this. And the new head of judiciary who came into play, another barrister, Richard Whittam, KC, put out some sanction guidelines to say we're taking this seriously and there's a need for a deterrent. And anyone who's now sent off for match official abuse will not only have to have their sanction as per normal, but will add an aggravating factor to it. So Richard's taking it seriously. The RFU has taken it seriously, but other sports are as well. I was speaking to Mike Riley a couple of weeks ago. Mike Riley used to be the head of PGOML, who the organisation who runs all the professional referees in football, explaining to me there's been a loss of over 10 to 15% of match officials across Europe who referee football in the community. And that main reason for that is around the abuse that they're facing. So we're seeing other sports dealing with it. We've heard about body cameras in football. We've heard about, heftier sanctions. But also we're looking at ways of dealing with it online as well, because that's one of the areas where there has been a huge increase of abuse. How do you deal with online abuse? And that can be through identifying people. That can be through punishing people. That can be telling people they can't go to their clubs anymore. So it's an array of things. It's not going to be one thing. It's not going to be one silver bullet that fixes this, but it's great that everyone's talking about it at the moment.
And you talked about there the different types of abuse that can be faced. Would you say there is a difference between the abuse sustained by referees who do grassroots matches compared to those who do international competitions?
And probably because you don't have the furore of social media when you're at the community game. I'm sure a lot of people are on social media, but the backlash of one decision in a game leading to a high-profile coach commenting on your performance, leading to a pile-on, on social media around your performance. You don't get that in a community game. But remember, in a community game, you tend not to have 3 or 4 of your colleagues around you. It's just you on a field, in the middle of some recreation ground. It's just you. And it's that idea that, I go to Twickenham, I go to the Stade de France. I've got security guards around me if I need them. I've got a nice, lovely change room and I can go back to. Some of the stories that you hear across all sports, about match officials being abused on the way to their cars, match officials being physically and verbally threatened. Those are the ones where we do need to, take a strong stance. And that's why something like, Richard Whitten's kind of guidelines is saying we've got to do better at this. And I think people do need to do better at this. And the one thing that rugby's always kind of championed itself on, and it's always, been one of the unique selling points, is that this is a game that is built on respect. And that means respect, like across between players and refs and players, coaches and players, coaches and refs, but also spectators have a part to play on that. So if you're standing on the sideline, effing and jeffing or criticizing, you're not buying into the values of rugby. And that's what makes our game so unique.
Absolutely. And when you talk there about the values of rugby, and you've also talked about the retention of match officials, how important would you say that this RFU crackdown on abuse is to the game of rugby as a whole?
It's back to that idea that Mike Riley was saying. If there is a reduction across Europe of football referees because they're concerned about the idea that they are not only verbally but physically abused, people aren't going to take up the whistle. They're not going to give it a go. And there's so much joy that can be taken out of refereeing. Meeting new people, being up close to some. I've seen some of the greatest games of rugby that's ever been played. In a box office seat. I've got to work with people who are the greatest players of all time. The Richie McCaws, the Sia Khaleesi's, the Martin Johnsons. So there's so much good that can be you can get out of rugby, but you have to have a passion for rugby. But also you've got to think, well, is it really worth it? And if you're being abused on a weekend, or if you're being kind of not being welcomed into a club, and you're not being paid for it, you would think twice.
Absolutely. Well, Wayne, I have to say the timer did go off probably about 2 minutes ago, but I was enjoying that discussion far too much. So I have gone overboard a little bit. So thank you so much for joining me today. That brings that discussion to an end. And what a way to kick off season 2 of the podcast. Thank you for giving up your time today. And thank you to the listeners as well. So that brings this episode to an end, but do listen to our episode next week, which moves from rugby to football, and in particular explores the rise of women's football. We'll see you then.